الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Assalamu alaikum. It's truly a pleasure to be here in my home country, I guess, after coming back after 12 years. It's nice to see this critical conversation taking place with so many young individuals, with so many professors, with ulama and academicians. It's really heartening to see that. And I am very honored to be able to play a short, small role in this conversation, inshallah. So I wanted to start with the benediction that I read, the dua that we made, that Allah cause us to benefit. Allahumma linna bima yanfa'una, teach us that which is He causes to benefit us. Allahumma linna bima yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima tu'allimuna, and give us benefit from that which you teach us. وَزِدْنَا عِلْمًا تَعْلِيمٌ عِلْمًا إِنَّكَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ, and increase us in knowledge and teaching, because you are the one that has power of all things. So may Allah help us to be amongst those who benefit from what I present today. So without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about myself so that I can situate the comments I'm going to make, some which you will be pleased with, some which you will not, but I must tell you why and where I'm coming from. To begin with, my work has to do with this intersection as a researcher. I study the intersection of Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and medical practices. I do this in many different ways. One way to do that is to think about Muslim patients, how Islam informs their decisions, meaning Islamic values, the Islamic identity, how that informs the way they think about their health and how they engage with the healthcare system. I study how Islam informs the way that Muslim physicians think about their practice and the bioethical challenges that they face. And I study how Islam is used by our ulama to provide moral guidance for policymakers, for physicians, for patients, how they engage with this knowledge system of biomedicine in the various ways they do so. So I do textual, empirical, as well as discourse analysis. My own practice is on a different side. That's my research, but my practice has to do with the same intersection. So I spend time on ethics committees. I know we just heard before, there's no such thing as ethics, perhaps, in modernity. But I do serve on an ethics committee. Perhaps it's just procedural, but nonetheless, we do think about how our practice can be informed by peers and what is ethical and what is not ethical. I spend some time thinking about, I can barely see my own slides, but let's see. There we go. I spent some time thinking about how to inform people in our community settings as bioethics, right? So what is Islamic bioethics, what it is not, how we can think about our healthcare decisions. I spent some time as a consultant. Oftentimes, unfortunately or fortunately, people get my WhatsApp number and they call me, well, so-and-so is facing such and such challenge in the hospital. Can you help mediate between what the physicians are saying and what the ulama are saying? And then I spent some time, really now predominant part of my time as a physician. So in clinical practice itself, right? And thinking about how we have policies in the healthcare that advantage certain people and don't advantage others. And lastly, I spend time at this intersection with working groups. I will tomorrow spend some time sharing with you the methodology by which we engage people from the Islamic tradition, from medicine, and from other sort of ancillary sciences, and together in working groups and in councils. So that's my background, which will situate the comments that I have. And as any good instructor, I'm going to give you the money slide, is what we say in the United States. The money slide being all of what I'm going to say is going to be based on this slide. These are the answers, right? So I'm going to give you the answer to the question that was posed to me. What can Islamic bioethics, and I put Islamic in quotes because that's going to be a question that we're going to ask, learn from Islamic bioethics? Well, the first thing that we should learn is that we must properly conceive of the ethical problem space. And this has roots in our own tradition, that the ruling on a matter is a branch of, in the lexical sense, but really emerges from its taswir, its conceptualization, right? So no faqih should be talking about anything that he doesn't have a good taswir about. And so our problem in the AI ethics space or in Islamic bioethics is that we must properly conceive of the ethical problem space. So that's my first point. The second point is that we must delineate the multi, inter, or transdisciplinary nature of the work. Really, we have to figure that out. Whether we think it's multidisciplinary in the identification of the problem and the solution of the problem, whether it is actually interdisciplinary, that the solution does not reside in either of these fields, Islam or AI, but something in between, or whether it's transdisciplinary, it does not depend on any of these things, but it has to emerge through a new discipline itself. We must resolve the content of the Islamic, right? So many of us, particularly in Pakistan, you might say, Islam, I know. Today I heard many people invoking Islam. And when my students do that, I say, well, then tell me where Islam is. Who is this Islam that you're referring to? Because Islam involves multiplicities of practices and traditions and times, right? So there is some notion that we have to resolve what the Islamic is before we start to apply that to a discipline. And lastly, we must recognize the power dynamics in discourse and scholarship. So I'm not being Foucauldian, but I am being a little bit Foucauldian here, right? That there is truly a vocabulary that we use that informs the way we think about things, right? And so you must acknowledge the power structures that help us, or they set for us the language that we use by which we analyze the problems. And this will be my last point later on, a little bit about power dynamics. So that's the money slide. Those are the answers. Now I'm going to go backwards a little bit and give you the explanation for why these are the 4 things that AI ethics must learn from Islamic bioethics. So the first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical concerns of AI in biomedicine. And the second part, really about this emerging field of Islamic bioethics. And then the third part being discourse and power. So let's begin with this taswir, right? Trying to understand what is it when people are speaking about AI ethics in healthcare, at least. I can speak with that rootedness because I have some sense of what's happening in healthcare with AI and how we might address these issues from an Islamic perspective. So where is AI used in biomedicine today? It's used in many different areas, but these are the 3 dominant ones, right? A little bit in sort of virtual health assistants or chatbots, somewhat on treatment design, and so on and so forth. And this thing about treatment design is really, really advanced, right? So Watson, the IBI computer, is used by Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, a place I used to work, to think about, and they bring together many different data sources to think about how we must create personalized treatment regimens for cancer patients. Very advanced, pulling together data from the local healthcare system, from clinical trials, right? And from other areas as well. It's also advanced in chatbots. We actually use this in emergency medicine to have follow-up with patients who we think are high risk for certain diseases. We get their number, we have chatbots doing screening work, right? For whether they have relapses into certain sort of behavior patterns. So what has happened with this AI is that medicine has become a technet, right? That chatbots and Watson can replace the technical aspects of being a physician, right? And we have lost the praxis of the phronesis of that profession. This will be something I come back to in a few slides. So the domain, the larger scope of ethical concerns of AI in healthcare reside, in my view, right, in 2 sort of domains. One is epistemology and the other is ontology. So it's the epistemic framework, right? That knowledge has a positivistic view, that also all of knowledge is positivistic, right? That what is observable and quantifiable is therefore reality, right? This is how AI systems work. This is how modeling systems work, because the statistical models that follow suit from this epistemology are those that describe, predict, and you heard today from Professor Junaid a little bit about the other 2 steps in between, but they're looking at actuality here, or data inputs from those sources to be able to prognosticate or to predict in the healthcare system. There are embedded sort of maximization functions, is what we call them in biostatistics, all right? So we utility maximize or loss minimize, right? So meaning in this case for biostatistics and clinical medicine, and I was having a conversation in the sidebar about what people don't know how to read studies, yet they comment on them. You have to understand, was that study and the statistical method used to try to maximize the prediction or to minimize the loss? Minimize the error rate, false diagnosis, or to maximize positive diagnosis? If you don't know that, then don't read the study because you cannot interpret the abstract. That is the problem with individuals commenting on medicine. Nonetheless, what is lost for us as we think about ethicists is what is moral value? These functions have no embedded moral value. They're just maximizing something because they're told to do so. Whereas, as I said already, whereas medical praxis and phronesis, the role of the physician, where is that lost? And really, we think about the loss of patient agency and the virtuous physician, right? When you're using diagnostic algorithms and treatment algorithms based on AI. And the other concern I mentioned to you is about ontology, right? So the ontological schema that is used by AI, at least in healthcare, is reductionistic. Humans become intelligence, which we can then become artificial intelligence, right? And then reality, as I already mentioned, just becomes the realm of the observable. And we might say that there is more to reality than just the observable. And morality then becomes consequentialistic and utilitarian. right? So there's a reduction in all these three registers of ontology and then moral epistemology. And lastly, I would say then this leads to what we have of the fullness of the human being in healthcare is incredibly reduced. So there's limited insight or marginalization of the emotive aspects of individuals. You make decisions largely not based on rationality. We know this. It's based on emotion. But AI systems have no way to deal with emotion, right? If you follow Star Trek, we know that Data, right? The android wanted to have an emotion chip, right? He would make the best decisions, but he wanted to have an emotion chip. And we don't have any of that as of yet, an emotion chip to put into these AI systems. The other aspect is that, and this is what I was talking to another colleague in the sidebar, is that we've lost this notion of the counter world. When Islamic ethicists think about something, you're thinking about a counter world, an ideal, where we would like to be. And then we also think about the afterlife. How will this be seen in the afterlife? So the counter world to what is today, the afterlife being our orienting force. None of this is programmed into these algorithms and the ontological schema that we have. And then plurality is normative, right? Today in society, it's plural. It's a globalized society. You can be okay, and even in this country, we have plurality, right? Which is embedded into our moral structures so that we can live peaceably together in a tolerant society. You can't have that with a maximizing or minimizing functionality. And in medicine, at least, we have lost the role of uncertainty and the known unknown. Because I know there's no perfect solution, many solutions are possible based on your value system. That's how I deal with patients, right? You will lose that, and you do lose that when here's what the algorithm tells you is the 99th percentile what you should be doing. But we lose that. But that is not 99%, it's 99% of the data source that you had based on the observable notions of what should be done. So it is not 99%. We lose and forget the role of uncertainty. The last bit I'll say, again, this tasweer that we're doing of AI in healthcare at least, is this mediation and alteration powers of AI, right? So this cartoon here shows you that, and this is, you see every day on your WhatsApp, your Facebook or Twitter, whatever else it is, YouTube algorithms, that what you see is what is being fed to you, right? You're mediating your view of the world through AI. We do this by actually enhanced sensory perceptions as well. What you're seeing of the world is only a partial view mediated through these sorts of technological structures. And then what is choice but an illusion? What is choice but then an illusion? Because there is no choice. And we do this with our children. So you say, children, you can make a decision, but you give them two options, each of which you'd be okay with. They're making a decision, but you made the decision, right? And that is what is happening on the side as well. And the other piece is the alteration powers of AI, right? So medicine, we talk about the body. There's a notion of what is a normative body, right? And there's a telos, perhaps, to certain aspects of the body. But what ends up happening, or can potentially happen, is that you have now a different notion of the body is when you have all these wearables or implantables. They become part of you, right? Your ontology as a human being is different now. Your experience of the body is different. Not only that, you're reduced to just an information source. You're just an information source, not a being. You're an information source amongst many different information sources. And then the question becomes, does technology shape us, or do we shape technology? There is a relationship all the time between these sorts of things, right? Our expectations of what we can do are based on notions of what our limits are, but those limits change, then you have different notions of what you can do. And so, all right, this is a nice quote, right? Are we shaping our homes, technology, or is technology shaping us? So this was my part in helping us try to think about the tasweer before we have the ahkam, right, around AI in healthcare or elsewhere. And I think they're generalizable to other fields as well. And I will say, since I don't have, my colleagues aren't here, I think Jasar is speaking next, and perhaps he's listening. But I know we're going to spend a lot of time on ethics. So I'm going to give you my sort of view here about ethics of AI, that principles aren't enough and frameworks are insufficient. Why? Well, principles, and we do this a lot in bioethics, so I'll tell you, in medical ethics. So, they're universal, not contextual, right? That's the problem with principles, that they claim to be at least universal, not contextual, but everything that's happening in life is contextual to the individual. They're emotive beings. They're context dependent. They even think about their identity within the community, perhaps in our circle here. That principles oftentimes, and there's a little slight critique, a little bit of maqasid for a second, they have insufficient balancing mechanisms. So if you're going to use a part of our tradition that has balancing mechanisms, go ahead and use qawa'id because they have dawabit. But masalih and maslaha perhaps has a little bit of a check. Nonetheless, the issue is that we have insufficient balancing mechanisms within our own tradition. And when you program into a system, then you'll have a problem with these principles because they don't know how to balance them, how to prioritize based on context, because they're not universal. They require single, not plural solutions. So as I mentioned to you already, plurality is a value that is honored, given we want to live peaceably and tolerantly with others who are different from us. You can't do that in a single system by principles, and they're preset at the outset. Frameworks are insufficient because deliberation is not informed by praxis. Did I follow the framework? It's procedural, or did I not? And then in healthcare, at least you've lost the praxis I already mentioned of the human doctor in this contextually derived point. And the other aspect is that governance is local, not global. So we can have, right, a company ruling the United States, but has a global arm in 10 different countries. How are you going to govern that? We have this problem with trade. We would have the same problem, and we still have the same problem with frameworks in the AI space. For general artificial intelligence or for specialized artificial intelligence, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know until it happens. This was my question earlier today, Doctor. That was where I was coming with, right? We don't know what that will look like until it happens. To set up frameworks in advance, I think would be a little bit faulty. And then someone mentioned Rawls, so I'll say Rawls. Rawlsian theory is about wide reflective equilibrium, bringing principles into conversation with empirical data and legal data and sociological data. Frameworks without that equilibrium are insufficient. All right, okay. So lastly, I'll say, since we're in Islam Muslim context, I would like this. I would like us to inform ourselves from theology and kalam. Then we go to usul and maqasid and the fiqh. I would like it to be that way. In reality, they all come together. They're all in the same space mind of the mufti, right? But what we do often is just deal with the end result, the fiqh, and then we back jigr and maqasid to help with the fiqh, and we forget about the theology arriving it. In healthcare, what is the human being? Who is the human person? These are questions that we don't have a great answer to. We have plural views on these sorts of things. Therefore, frameworks can't be sufficient. All right, so that was the first part of my talk. I hope you have a good tasveer. Many tasveer achhi nahi hai. Shayad uski tasveer achhi thi, so the slides achhi. So now we're going to talk about Islamic bioethics, and I'm going to do a deep dive on the two other questions I said. There are 4 answers I'm going to deliver. These are the 2 other ones. We have to think about the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary nature of the field before we venture into it. And then we have to think about what our Islam means, right? What is the Islamic label that we want to apply? So when we think about Islamic bioethics, often, if I were to ask you here, some of your students, this is what you would say. Usually Islamic bioethical views come in this modality. This is a discourse that happens, that you have a physician, oftentimes, perhaps informed by a patient, who goes to a religious scholar. The scholar thinks about the Quran, the Sunnah, the maqasid and the qawa'id, and he issues or she issues a ruling, a fatwa, which grades that thing in a moral status spectrum, right? From prohibited to permissible. That Islamic bioethics would be this. This is a discourse that comes to mind. And then we spend a lot of time as academics thinking about this discourse, writing books and collections, or having conferences that are based on the fatwa discourse as the dominant, or perhaps sometimes the only, notion of what Islamic bioethics is. But the problem is with that the past is that we have not explored the problem space in its multiple dimensions. And certainly if we haven't done that, then the solution also comes from a single dimension, a single discipline. As I mentioned to you, we must figure out where Islamic bioethics resides here. Does it reside as a multidisciplinary field where the understanding, description of the problem comes from multiple fields sitting together? Here's the sociological, here's the empirical, here's the clinical, perhaps. Then we come together with a solution that comes from all these fields. Is it interdisciplinary? That Islamic bioethics resides in between 2 different fields, Islamic studies and bioethics, right? And so it needs people with a foot in both worlds. Or is it transdisciplinary? It resides beyond these 2 fields and needs its own field to generate solutions. So let's take a look at bioethics. Many say academic or modern bioethics stems from either Georgetown or Randomized Potter, who are thinking about this appellation, right? That either we apply moral philosophy to medical dilemmas, the Georgetown mantra, or Potter said that we have to bridge fact and value to a bigger scope, not just medicine, but ecology and the life sciences. Nonetheless, around the same time, they're credited with starting this term bioethics, right? Bioethics, however, has multiple registers of ethical analysis, from normative, meta, applied, or descriptive, right? What should I do? How do I know? What should I do? Which things should we address? And how should I do them? How should I apply them today, right? That's the field. It is either moral philosophy to medical dilemmas or facts and values to ecology, life sciences. And all these registers come together. So when you're doing bioethics, right, and you're trained to do bioethics, clinical ethics, you recognize there's a multidisciplinary field of inquiry with subfields, right? So you have to know public health ethics or teach public health ethics. These are the 4 different, there are many more than this. But in any case, there are multiple disciplinary fields of inquiry with subfields, and you use multiple methods, normative sort of rules and theories, or casuistry, which is something that we do with a lot of fatwa, or legal or narrative. There are many different ways of resolving ethical issues within bioethics. Now, I mentioned to you that Islamic bioethics is what? A question goes to a mufti who answers a question from the law. This is not the field, right, that you're talking to. So Islamic bioethics flattens the dimensionality of bioethics, right? It privileges, from our own tradition, first of all, I said it doesn't do any of this stuff, but from our own tradition, it flattens it even still. So we privilege fiqh and individual action over other sources of moral or morality in the Islamic tradition, right? So if you take the classical idea of you have agent-based, action-based, and end goal-based morality, we have disciplines within our tradition that speak to that. Theology, philosophy, usul al-kalam speak to the production of end goal. Reduce sickness, maybe? What is sickness? That comes from theology, right? Fiqh, we know, is individual moral status, but we have adab and akhlaq you heard about today, that agent-focused. So even in the spectrum from our own tradition, we privilege one over the others. Forget about what's happening in the world of bioethics. It lacks multidisciplinarity, so it privileges doctors and jurists, and I know that I am a doctor, and so I recognize that problem. And it's a reactive discourse, right? So it reacts to or responds to techno-scientific developments in the West, a sort of a imported scientific and bioethical paradigm. A running joke is that a lot of Muslim nations want to bring Western academies onto their shores to teach them how to do something, or to the best way to teach something, right? To learn something, so that their students can then no longer have to go and study in the West, where they're decadent lifestyles. But what you import is not only the science, but the cultural paradigm within which that science works. And oftentimes you have insufficient understanding of that, so the instructors are mediating between the text and the context, only see the text, don't see the context. And so you leave with people who are confused. And speaking of that, let's go to what is the dominant mode of engagement of Islamic bioethics, so to speak, right? It is what I would call a visitor model. It's reactive, right? So you see here the sheikh coming and looking at the baby in an incubator, right? It's reactive to a development from somewhere else. Neither that ventilator or that incubator was made in that country, right? Like you see today, this comes from elsewhere. It's important, that technology. And the training of that nurse, same. Not from our country or somewhere else. So bioethics topics are addressed by Islamic authorities, however you want to construct them, in a visitor model. What's left unaddressed is the entire edifice. What is the nature of the field? Why are these questions posed in this sort of way? What worldview are they coming with? And so the other issue, as I mentioned, particularly for us in this conversation, this global conversation, is where is plurality and pluralism and diversity in this conversation? Within the Muslim tradition and outside of? How do we engage with that? So that's the dominant model of engagement. So what ends up happening to those who want to talk about Islamic ethics or Islamic bioethics is that you have a quasi-utilitarian moral calculus, which leaves society as it is. The status quo remains the status quo. What do I mean? On one hand, you use darura, that because there is a dire need, someone's going to die, do it, right? It's the lower hand. Like, this is society, we got to use these medications because people are dying. Or you say, no, people are being saved, let's lose maslaha. Ipso facto, both of them lead to leaving the status quo as it is. We might like maslaha as positive. We might not like darura as negative, but maslahatan or daruratan mubah, yeah, mashi, no problem. And that's what ends up happening in the deliberation between scholars and physicians in Islamic bioethical juridical academies. Now, I'm overplaying my hand a bit, but you'll get a sense this is a discourse if you read it. Now, to intervene upon that, we start talking about maqasid sharia, right? I won't spend too much time with many more learned scholars speaking about that. But what I will say, however, is that if you want to think about maqasid of something, maqasid sharia, that you have a jurist, right? A scholar thinking about a certain state of affairs, as I mentioned, right? And seeing, well, why is that certain state of affairs not how it should be, the counter world, the ideal, that requires you think about human interests, right? Masalih are human interests. So are interests at risk? If you want to say they're the 5 or the 6, daruriyat, fine. Does hardship, mashaqqa predominate? And then are these human interests preserved or facilitated? You must think about this thing at hand, the situation, the social context, right? The clinical context, the societal context, and think in your mind, are these human interests privileged or not, are threatened? Either in the state presently or in the future state I want to bring about. Now, to do that requires data from both scripture and society. To successfully interrogate society in that condition is not what you want. You have to understand what that condition is. And if you want to bring about a proposed state of affairs and you say that's rooted to the Quranic revelation and the Quranic hadith, our revelation, then you must understand what that means in scripture. So you need to bring together both knowledges, right? And you must have, in Ghazali's terms, husuli and huduri knowledge, acquired and presential knowledge. So the point here is that it cannot be done just by an individual who has a set of knowledge from the society or by someone who has only scriptural knowledge. Both must come together. So that's my sort of critique again of that model, just jurists and doctors. Now let me share a little bit about what this happens in this moral calculus, right? We heard a little bit about this today. Hopefully we can hear more about it tomorrow. So when we do think about that quasi-utilitarian calculus, we think about harms and benefits, maslaha and mafsada, as you heard earlier today, right? Fiqh al-muwazanat, as we would say in the Khalij, right? So we're thinking about harms and benefits. So maslaha on one hand, darura on the other hand. That is occurring at what register here? At the implications and ramifications of that technology. It's already out of the box. It's already there. What is left when you want to have an ethical or moral analysis of technology and society, you first must start on the other side. What is the nature and the essence of the object to be acted upon by this technology? What is the subject? Either if it's economics, what is the subject? What's going to happen to the subject? Or if it's bioethics, same thing. We are here, it starts there. Then you must think about the origin of the sciences, right? We were talking about today, you want to be critically evaluative of the literature that exists, then think about how has science been generated, what is it talking about, right? And then you can get to, okay, this aspect and get to a moral assessment. We again have flattened dimensionality, stuck here, not thought about there, right? So that's the other problem. So in Islamic bioethics, I usually put the slide up. It's not in great color because I didn't update it yet, but I put the slide up to say that we can certainly have the moral machinery of Islam there, but it must be in conversation with all of these other ancillary fields to generate Islamic bioethics. Otherwise, you're not doing the work that you want to do. And the same thing would be true for AI ethics. All right, so that was Islamic bioethics. Now let's talk about Islam, because the conference poster says Islamic ethics and AI, with no quotes around the Islamic. So Marhum Shahab Ahmed, who taught me at AUC, and ended up being at Harvard, wrote this. It's a huge book. It's like 500 pages about what is Islam. But he talks about Islam in many different ways. Because everybody, this knee-jerk reaction to modernity, you want to reclaim it by labeling something Islamic. Well, Islamic means two things at least, right? It's a source of moral normativity, right? For us, we feel comfortable as Muslims to say something is Islamic, so we want to generate normativity. But to do that, you have to think about the methods of deriving those norms. How you access tradition matters before you think about what the Islamic is. And I'm not talking about Maturidi, Ash'ari, and Mu'tazili thoughts. I'm just talking about just a general view here of what the Islamic is. So what does that mean for us as applied scientists? Well, if we're going to apply it to a field, we have to think about, well, what does Islamic mean here? Is it Quran and Sunnah based? Whatever is within the scripts, that's all where we're going. And if it's univocal, then we apply it. If it's not univocal, we don't know what to do with it. It's an Islamic Kate. It's been produced in a society where Islam was a dominant cultural force, right? So we then reify the historical texts of scholars living in the Islamic world, and that's what they did then. So we're going to bring it now, whether it's in the 12th or the 17th century. Is it just Muslimness? Do we believe that there's a fitrah sense within Muslims and the way they act? And so we can generate some norms. You might say this is odd, but what is Amal al-Madina but that? What is in Maliki fiqh Amal al-Madina but that? That you have normativity amongst the actions of individuals. Now I know it's different, but I'm giving you an analogy here because you believe they have a moral uprightness within them. And then, or is it just non-contrary to Quran and Sunnah? All we care about is just not what, if it's not explicitly against Quran and Sunnah, it's okay, it's mashi. Or is it just moral intuition? You have to have a notion of what Islamic is before you put these things on labels on working groups or conferences or books or papers. And oftentimes we don't do that hard work. We just like to have the label there. Okay, all right, some things you'll like what I say, some things you won't like what I'm saying. So now we're going to get to near the end so we can have some conversation, inshallah, where I can clarify myself. So as I said, we have to think about knowledge and power, right? And so I was brought here because we think I know a little bit about Islamic bioethics. Perhaps something's happening there. Well, you know, when I think about bioethics, I think about academic bioethics. So I was trained in the academy, and we have centers of bioethics, right? The Hastings Center, a think tank, or we have, this is Tuskegee Center, a learning center of bioethics where they give you degrees, masters and PhDs, for example. And when you think about bioethics, right, you have to have a think tank, oftentimes a policy arm, educational institute, and then you have to have degrees to train other people, right? So there are master's programs, only 28 in bioethics in the United States, 18 schools offer doctorates, very few offer undergraduate degrees. So a discipline needs to be created, right, around that line or that field. So then you can, once you have that, you can have output. So books, right, by major academic presses on bioethics, and then you have journals where you have a discourse, an academic discourse on bioethics, right? So, or any other field, replace that with AI ethics. Centers, education institutes, books, right, from normative, from authoritative presses, and then journals. But Islamic bioethics is stuck in this mode. This is a flyer of a talk of a venue, a lecture that I was asked to participate in with others, and this was blasted around the undergraduate campus with this flyer. And I asked the question, well, who would want to come? This is in the University of Pennsylvania. Who would want to come to this lecture by this picture? It seems to me that it is about this topic. Islam is already an evocative word of people in some different country that does not look like a normal hospital in the United States, with people who observantly are Muslim. These are not people walking around the halls of that undergraduate campus. So it is an exotic thing. Who would want to come to this lecture? And Islamic bioethics is exotified as well, right? We have no centers for Islamic bioethics. We have no degree granting programs. We have internships, one that I run at my own place and one another in Saudi Arabia. And we have no Medline Next journals on Islamic bioethics. It's exotic. When we're brought into conversation, it's because we want to be inclusive. You're the diverse person. But there is no rootedness. It is marginalized, right? That's what I mean about knowledge, power, and discourse. So we might think it's powerful, but in the real sphere, it's not powerful. Further on, no endowed chairs at leading bioethics centers that produce the knowledge of that field. And of the top 10 bioethics journals by Medline H indexing, right? These are the only people who have some claim to the notions of Islam, right? Varda Chaim is the one who wrote that book. She's an Israeli scholar who wrote that book on bioethics. Ali Raza Bagheri is a Shi'i individual who lives in Canada, and on two others, I am on the editorial board, but that's it. So these are the normative structures of discourse on bioethics, and that's all you have from a population of what, 2 billion plus? And what does that lead to? I said papers, right? So this is from one of my mentors. He's in Qatar. I told everybody I was in Qatar in 2004. This is Pablo. He sponsored me to come spend some time in Qatar and Cornell a long time ago, right? So he did this analysis of, okay, at that time, the discourse in Medline around religious things in death and dying. And so for every 7 papers on Christianity and Christian views, there were 6 papers on Jewish views, 1 paper on Muslim views, right? That's the reality. You don't have academies, you don't have a field, you don't have training institutes, you don't have production of knowledge in that area. So I don't know if you want to really learn a little bit from AI, from Islamic Bioethics for AI ethics. I think there are a lot of missteps. So I'll end with sort of saying that, right, as I mentioned, knowledge is power, information is liberating. This is part of our tradition, Rabbi Zidni ilman, right? So may He increase us in knowledge. And that's how I started off the talk with making dua for that, because truly we do need ilman wa ta'liman, right? We need all this stuff because we can't do it ourselves. So what, again, the money slide, what can we learn for Islamic AI ethics from Islamic bioethics? The first, we must probably conceive of the ethical problem space, right? That we must delineate the multi, inter, or transdisciplinary nature of the work. We must do that at the outset before we start pontificating where it resides. I have some thoughts, maybe you have others. We must resolve the content of the Islamic. I mentioned to you, it's not a simple label. There's content fullness there that must be brought out. And then we must recognize the power dynamics in discourse and scholarship. If we really want to change the field, we must really want to change the field and invest in those structures to do so. Well, with that, I will end with these nice parting thoughts, which are not as nice, but I appreciate the time. Thank you. Jazakallah khair.